Hi everyone! This is the video for lesson 1.2. Our learning target today is I can recognize other types of verbs, including those functioning as action, linking, and compound verbs in a sentence. So make sure you do have your Cornell notes out, and we're going to go ahead and get started. So remember, over here in the left, we're going to write our questions for today's lesson. The lesson is 1.2, and the questions we're going to be going over: what is a verb, and how can I recognize action and linking verbs? So just a reminder of what a verb is from last time. A verb is a word or phrase that expresses action, condition, or state of being of the subject. Remember, the really important thing that we talked about is that a verb is always the first thing you look for in the sentence. We have to be able to find the verb first. We talked last time about there being 3 types of verbs: helping, linking, and action. Other than memorizing the helping verbs, we're never going to quiz you on what type each verb is, okay? So that's kind of something that's important to note. The reason I'm using these names is just to help you see how the verbs function in the sentence. Our end goal is just for you to be able to identify those so that you always know what the verb or verbs are in the sentence. So just kind of a heads up on that. All right, so the first one we're going to talk about are action verbs. These are going to be any verb that completes, like it sounds, an action, and that can be physical or mental. So that's kind of important to note. Something we want to get in the habit of doing is just asking, can you do it? Is this something you can do now? Is it something you can do tomorrow? That's going to help you to identify those action verbs, those things you can do. For example, sometimes those are going to be more physical actions, right? I smiled at the baby. I notice that smiled is a physical thing I can actually do. I can do that now. I can do that tomorrow. So remember, we're going to mark those verbs by boxing them. So I smiled at the baby. Sometimes they might be more of a mental action, like Philip considered all his options. Even though it's not a physical action, Philip can still do that thing, right? He can still consider his options. So we're going to box that as a verb, and is specifically an action verb as well. Linking verbs are a little trickier because they do what's called linking the subject to its description. And the reason that they're a little tricky is that sometimes they're going to look like our helping verbs, sometimes they're going to look more like an action verb. Again, I don't need you to necessarily tell me that they're a linking verb, but you do just need to get used to being able to find them as a verb in the sentence. So for example, notice in this sentence, it was a sad day. We should be recognizing that verb was as one of our 23 helping verbs, but notice there's not another verb that was is helping in this sentence. So in this case, was is actually a standalone verb as a linking verb, linking it to its description, sad day. Sometimes, like I said, those verbs might seem more action-y. So Caitlin seemed nervous. Can she seem? Can she do that thing? Sure, that's a mental action that she can take, right? So that's going to link Caitlin, our subject, to her description, nervous. Okay, let's do a little bit of practice on basic action and linking verbs. Okay, now that we've gone over those, a few other things we want to note. You always want to think about the function in the sentence. And this is tricky because sometimes even a word that might look like an action might not actually be the action in that sentence. So let me give you a couple of examples. In this one, potato chips crunch too loudly to eat during an exam. You can see that in this sentence, the verb crunch is actually the action that's happening, right? The potato chips are actually crunching. They are crunching right now. Okay. However, in this sentence, the crunch of the potato chips drew the angry glance of Miss Orsini to our corner of the room. Notice, even though the potato chips are crunching, that's not the action that's happening in that sentence, right? That's not our main verb. Instead, it's going to be drew, because that's what the potato chips are doing. They're drawing the angry glance. So notice sometimes even the same word, depending on the context of the sentence, might function differently. We also want to think about if there's more than one verb. So sometimes we're going to have something called a compound verb where there's two separate action verbs or two separate verbs. And sometimes, like we learned last time, we're going to have a helping verb. So a helping verb that's assisting the main action verb. For example, the baby kicked and screamed. The baby is physically kicking and screaming, right? Those are both action verbs, and we call that a compound verb because there's two of those verbs happening. Kind of similar, he watched TV while I read. So notice he is watching TV while I am reading. Those are both actions, so those are going to be two separate verbs. That one's a little different though because they have two different subjects, which is something we'll get to later, right? He is watching while I am reading. So that's kind of something to note. Finally, talked about our helping verbs. I am going to the park. Going is something I'm doing. What's helping that? That helping verb am, right? So we're going to box that whole thing. I am going to the park. Last consideration are things called contractions, so those shortenings of words. The reason we want to split those apart is because contractions are often made up of verbs, and we need to see distinctly what is making up that word. For example, I won't hear of it. This is kind of tricky because if we look at won't on its own, it doesn't really seem like there's a verb there. But if we split up won't into what it actually stands for, will not, notice hear is my action, I can hear something, and we know will is one of my helping verbs. So actually, I need to box both of those, will hear. We're going to leave not alone because not is not an action, right? I can't not something, and we also know it's not one of our helping verbs. So see how important it was to split apart that contraction because I've eliminated one word and I've found a clear helping verb. Another quick example, he isn't going to be happy. He has the action of going, right? He can do that. We need to split apart isn't into is not, and we should recognize is as that helping verb, boxing is and going. And again, we're going to leave not alone. All right, so after those considerations, there should be some additional practice for you. All right, finally, 3 things at the end of the video. Add to your notes, especially those practice examples that you may have struggled on or missed. Let me know what questions you have at the end of the video and determine what kind of practice you're going to do for this learning target.